Welcome to our very first episode together. We thought, what better way to kick off this mentorship series than with some horror stories from teaching yoga? So if you've ever taught a class and felt like you were the only one winging it, this is for you. And if you don't know who I am, I write Monday morning emails to our members, and I am the community manager for Heart and Bones Yoga.
My name is Ula, and you're amazing. And we love you so much in our Heart and Bones community.
I'm excited because I feel like this is a true behind the scenes look. Like, we have these conversations together all the time and we get very fiery and very excited. So I'm excited to show people what it's like behind the scenes. But Brea, you are our lovely founder of Heart and Bones Yoga, mentor to hundreds of teachers and thousands of students. So you're also someone who's definitely, I'm sure, taught classes where things did not go quite as planned. And you're also going to be leading our upcoming mentorship. So I feel like these kind of honest behind the scenes conversations, if you love this kind of stuff, you're going to love the mentorship program. And I know that you do also bring this into our teacher training, our 200 and 300 hour teacher training as well. So I feel really excited to kind of like open the curtain a little bit, like this is going to be fun. I was just curious, when you first started teaching yoga, it was in person. Do you remember what it was like? Do you remember that first class? Like, were you confident or were you terrified, or what was going through your head? Like day one.
Oh, yes, the good old days. So let's also keep in mind too, the funny part is I got certified in 2003. That was a long time ago. And technically my first teaching was before I was certified. I wasn't in a studio or anything. It was a friend. He was a teacher at a school. I was practicing yoga. They asked if I would teach and I was like, oh, I don't know. And so in a way, I don't really count that one quite as my first teaching. What I remember after I finished my teacher training. So back in 2003, I did a month-long like Shivananda. You basically spent a month at an ashram in a very more traditionally yogic-ish environment, so to speak. And what was really beautiful about that training, and this will come to my first class, is there's a lot of mantra and philosophy. And we were taught in the Shivananda tradition to have this long mantra to sing at the beginning of your class. And so now I look back at this with the wisdom of somebody who's been teaching for 20 plus years. And I was in my early 20s. Bless my innocent, earnest little heart, because I just remember, again, this is like 2003. Yoga was just in the city that I was teaching in. Yoga was just starting to become a lot more mainstream and popular. And I had just come from this very like yoga infused ashram life. And it was spending probably about 5 minutes singing a very long, involved Sanskrit mantra. And it's not to say, and that actually kind of talks about a whole side conversation about the appropriation of yoga, how we have whitewashed it, how we've cherry picked it. And that's a different conversation, but something to acknowledge. So as I'm talking about, me sort of earnestly singing this mantra, it's just interesting and on a lot of levels. And I do remember people in the classes, I think some of them being like, okay. Because it's, like this is not a fitness thing. This is yoga. So it's kind of honoring that tradition. I just winged it. I just remember it being earnest. I remember being really passionate and earnest. And I don't think it was great. I don't think anybody's first classes are ever going to be amazing. Don't expect that, my friends. Like the only way, in my opinion, to get good at teaching is just to teach and teach a lot, teach poorly, make a lot of mistakes, and just have very small expectations on yourself. Because also, I say that with confidence because quite often the people in the classes don't realize, like, you've got all these reasons as to why that class might have been not great. A lot of the times the people in the class have no idea and they probably loved it.
I was thinking like my first experience, I, was actually like practicing teaching is kind of where I was thinking back to. And I remember trying to teach my mom in her living room. And she had like arthritis in her hands and her wrists. And as a new, not even graduated teacher, to your first student to be like, oh, I can't put my hands down flat because of like my wrists hurts and I have arthritis. I was like, oh my God. So anatomy, how do I teach a class that is accessible? And I think that was scary, but like such a safe place to practice with my mom, because then it gave me things to follow up on. Because then I realized I'm healthy and fit and I can do these things, but my mother can't. And it was a really, really sharp reminder. And I know for you, that's going to be a big part of the mentorship as well, is just like, how do you even tackle a sustainable class? Do you have a moment like that in your teaching where you were just like kind of blindsided by someone?
I think there's been many moments. I think that's the whole genesis of where I am now as a teacher and why and who and how I teach, because I would say that, and this is a master generalization, but the majority of our yoga trainings, and I hope and I think and I pray that they're all changing now, more and more so, but most yoga teacher trainings don't prepare us for it, for teaching in those ways that, you're like, these are the cues that you say for this pose. And then you've been taught this, and then you enter your classes, and then you're saying the cues, and you're like, oh, wait, those cues don't actually land in these bodies. Your mom, you're like, and that's again going, and this is no shame on Shivananda. It's just that was my first training that I'd ever done. And like, I believe if I'm remembering it correctly, shoulder stand was part of the warm up or something wild like that. I don't think, and again, please, this was 20 something years ago. I pretty quickly stopped teaching that sort of Shivananda tradition or whatnot, but I know all I remember is shoulder stand happened. And that, like, there's no accommodations for different bodies. And that's a pose I can't even remember the last time I taught shoulder stand. So I think for me, pretty quickly, so I can't remember one time in particular. I think it was more of a number of times. It was just like, okay, over and over, I want to be a teacher who's helping people. It was never enough for me just to say the script. It was never enough for me to just like, okay, this is what I was taught. I'm going to teach it exactly in that way. But what was hard was that I struggled for a lot of times because over and over and over, I would see what I was taught and how I was taught to practice as somebody who is a able-bodied 20-something-year-old, although I did not come into yoga flexible at all. I was not one of those people. I actually was very unflexible. And so that was work for my body actually to get in. But I was also in my early 20s, so my flexibility showed up fast. But that being said, so as a teacher, I felt like I was in the woods for a long time because I'm like, well, I'm seeing what I was taught, but it's not landing in the bodies. It's not landing in ways but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what I should say. And so it took me a very long time to start to actually like look outside of the yoga world and get education in different ways of movement, just so I could understand the body and help people move better.
I think there's like, for a lot of people that are, for the first time potentially looking at their teacher training, this assumption that all teacher trainings are equal, and they're not. I remember friends that went through more of like what you did, which is like a 1-month intensive in different country or something like that. And for myself, I didn't do that because I felt like that is really great for a personal practice, but by no means will I feel prepared to be a teacher when I return. I feel it would be like the step one of teaching. Like the amount of knowledge as required for becoming a teacher is just so vast. And I think a lot of that knowledge actually needs time to sit, and you need to work through it and practice doing it. And yeah, it's like, I think you need time, which I think is the genius of having the training online right now, because it allows you the time to do these things and come back with questions, where I think like a 1-month intensive doesn't really leave room for that. I know for myself, like horror story wise, I felt like maybe because I was a runner, I was always attracting injured runners. I know I run and I happen to teach yoga, but I am not a doctor. Like, and you've talked about this in the past where it's like my nightmare situation is someone coming up to me being like, my doctor said I should come do yoga and I just had knee surgery, or I just injured my hamstrings. What should I do? And I'm like, welcome to my yin class where all we're going to be doing is stretching. Do you have any advice for new teachers when something like that happens?
I wish it was easy as saying, here's the 5 things that you should always do. I can't ethically be a teacher teaching other teachers to teach without acknowledging the bigger pictures. Like nothing that you're going to get in this series is going to be the one size fits all. Nothing we're going to get out of any teacher training is going to give us the tools to be like, again, here's my script to say for Trikonasana. Here's my like da da da. And I say that because it's important to acknowledge that human movement is complex and yet totally simple, but very complex. And people will be coming to us as like, just as you said, funny, you're like, well, I don't know. Here's my yin class. Yeah. Like, how is this? So the first place that we go is acknowledging like, well, what is our scope of practice? So as teachers who are experienced, if we're new teachers, if we're thinking about teaching, yoga teachers in the West predominantly teach a movement-based asana practice. We, of course, know that yoga is more than just asana, that it's this whole beautiful ancient philosophy that has been passed to us here in the West from India, from thousands of years old. So it's got this, like, there's this beautiful wisdom tradition. And most of the classes that most people are going to be teaching are going to be movement movement based. And there seems to be some reason that doctors in the last 20 years will just go do yoga. And yeah, not all yoga is created equal. And not, as you said, not all yoga teacher trainings are created equal. And so if I don't know one teacher who hasn't had that moment where they're like, so know what your role is. And I think there's a fine line and a really interesting, beautiful intersection in my experience of learning more about the body, learning more about human movement. What do shoulders need? What do hamstrings need? Okay, if there is an injury in a generalized sense, how can I support it? While also knowing it's not my role to fix a body. It's not my role to diagnose somebody's injury. And most often in a general way, in a public class, most yoga teachers, it's not our role. It's our role just to offer a movement and mindfulness, if I'm really drilling it down simply, experience. So if somebody has an actual injury, the first thing, and it's what you said too, it's like the first thing that I say is, well, have you gone to a physiotherapist? Okay, cool. If not, maybe go there first and get their recommendations. Okay. Or maybe they did go to a physiotherapist and the physiotherapist said, yeah, you can do XYZ and don't do these kind of movements. And so that can inform me a little bit more of like, okay, we've got the scientific background. They've sort of gotten the approval to show up to the class to be able to do the things. And then you can go from there. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing, is to remember it's important to be able to refer out. It's important to be able to say no as a teacher, to say like, I can't help you. This class is not a fit, but I do know this person who does more yoga therapy or who does this really gentle for injury or runners class. Like, right. Like we should not be the teacher for everybody and all conditions. Yes, yoga can help us, but knowing our boundaries within that is a huge thing. In fact, in our teacher training, it's literally one of the big 4 main pillars that we teach is just boundaries and movement, boundaries as a teacher, knowing who we are as a teacher is just.
Yeah, that's the knowing who you are as your teacher. I think that's going to be the opening mentorship call, is it not? Like understanding who you want to be as a teacher. And I know like for myself, when I took my teacher training, it actually wasn't to be a teacher. Like I was actually looking to, deepen my own practice. And I thought, man, I'm going to this like class 5 days a week. What if I just took that money and invested it into training, into myself? It felt like a gift to myself. It was actually my birthday gift to myself, to be honest. So it felt like a true investment into me. And as I went and progressed through the training, I realized how wonderful it was to share the practice. So it was an unexpected result was that I became a teacher. But I wanted to go back to something you said in the opening about not bringing in your book. And it just made me think like, I know for myself, when I started teaching, I would always show up with a pre-planned class. Just, and over time, I referenced it less and less. And I built my like kind of mental repertoire of this is going to work, this doesn't. And it was amazing. I felt like once I got into it, I was able to really like just be in the moment, like truly see the class and be with them at the same time. Versus when I first started, I would have this like little planner and be like, cannot deviate. If you make me deviate, I will crash and burn in the middle of this class. What is your thought on that? Like, do you think it's okay for teachers to bring, notebooks in? Do you have like a experience where you're like, oh God, I'm never doing this again? Or how do you prep your classes? Because you teach online, which is like so different now.
I teach online predominantly and then in-person workshops. But I spent, I think, a good at least, 18 years teaching in person. This is actually a question that I think comes up every single year that we run our teacher trainings, because like a lot of people in their previous teacher trainings will have had they were told, never bring in your book. You have to have everything memorized. Don't look at your notes. It looks unprofessional. And I just think that's such a disservice, because it goes back to that first question that you mentioned, and why that's the first thing that we talk about in the mentorship, which is like, know who you are as a teacher and as a person. So I think, I laugh because Ula and I are very similar and very different in some ways. Like, I was never that planner as a teacher, to my power and to my detriment at times. I don't think I've ever, I don't know, and I don't know if I should say this, but I don't know if I've actually ever written down a sequence for myself in my classes. But again, But does that make me a better or worse teacher? Does that make you a better, like, at all? It's like who we are as people. And I think, and I'm just thinking anecdotally over the years when this conversation comes up with other teachers, the teachers who need that plan, as you said, just to be like clear, confident, it's a safety net in a good way. Some people say that they bring their plan and never look at it, but just the fact that it's there. Know thyself. Like if that's you, hooray. And if it's not you, hooray. But both have a pro and a con, in my opinion. There is absolutely times where I have wung it. And there comes a point, here's the caveat, of course, comes a point when you're an experienced enough teacher that, you're never really winging it because and you can adapt and you can see there's like that real base of knowledge that just can come out in any given class. But how long that takes to happen could be, that's a years long practice. That's like that 10,000 hours type thing. Maybe not quite 1,000 hours. I hope it's quicker than that for a lot of us. But I do want to say that just know, like, there's never just one good way, because as much as like I can wing a class and feel confident, there have absolutely been times where I'm like, I'm going to wing it. And I leave that class in a cloud of like, wait, was that good? Did I, I actually find if I didn't have that plan, I can actually second guess myself. So even though me as a person feels more comfortable just sort of trusting my gut, seeing the room, responding as needed, depending on that, if I didn't, like, with zero framework, I don't have anything to judge myself against, in a sense. So that's maybe one of the cons of being a winger, a free flow person.
You're like year 20.
20
right?
plus,
So
yeah.
Yeah, 20 plus. So I think of like prep. I think new teachers, yeah, maybe you don't have your like sequence out in front, but you might want to prep. Like at least try the transition. Does it even make sense? But you've been doing it so long that you're like, you have that background knowledge and that experience. And I was just thinking, here's another, I feel like, myth where it's like every class has to be different. Every time you teach a class, it needs to be some like sparkle, like butterfly special, new playlist, new sequence, new whatever. And I think I fell into that trap in the beginning. I thought I was like a dance instructor, not a yoga teacher. And it's like always had to be spectacular. And what I realized was that like, I think students really appreciate feeling comfort and knowing what's coming. And there's something to be said when they fall in love with your teaching style, that they'll be like, I love that you give me extra time in Shavasana. And that's why I come to your class. I love that I know after standing, I'm going to be doing seated, and they spend less time like listening to you and like trying to guess your wacky next sequencing. And if that's you, that's great. But yeah, I just realized it wasn't me. So that's like another like myth. It's like constantly has to be new. Not true.
And that puts a lot of pressure on teachers. And I think what a great example of like, I felt like a dance teacher, like choreographer, rather than a yoga teacher. So again, the way my brain, and as somebody who's been teaching teachers for a very long time, and building yoga teacher curriculum, like taking a lot of really big concepts and ideas and trying to make them make sense for all of us. One of the ways that I answer that question is in our training, and anytime I'm teaching teachers, I talk about what I call the 4 pillars of a sustainable yoga practice. And it applies to the anatomy, and it applies to this kind of conversation. And two of the pillars, one is variety and diversity, and one is frequency. How that answers your question now, like what do we do as teachers? What's the balance of familiarity, right? Repetition. And what's the balance of new snazzy, like, let's do this. And I think when we look at it through like the mind and the body and the nervous system really loves variety and diversity. And the mind, the body, the nervous system also loves familiarity. And just like everything, because we want to try to move beyond binaries. One is not better, one is not worse. It's kind of it needs to be a mix of both. So in the sequencing your classes question, and how much do I do as a teacher of familiarity, like I actually go back to one of my first classes that I ever took as a student. And I think that teacher, so I was lucky to have had a teacher who did a really good job of it. So me being that beginner yoga student who's new to this, who's very inflexible, I think it was like a 6 or 8 or 10 week, pre-registered course, beginner's course. And she did a really beautiful balance of like, okay, we were doing the same movements every single week. And then she would throw in a couple new ones. And as the beginner who had never done this, who was not a flexible person and all that stuff, I found it so rewarding. And I really remember this very clearly. I found it so rewarding to see my progress on a physical level over the weeks when we're doing the same thing. And I was like, oh, wow, in week 1, I could barely do that lunge. Now in week 5, it doesn't actually hurt as much. And when she would throw in a new fun pose, I was able to do it better because I had built the consistency and the basis of those familiar movements that then when something new and different came, I felt more confident to do it.
Yes. It feels so good as a student to see progress. Like even if it's incremental, even maybe you're not reaching further, but it feels better.
Yeah, and so as teachers, it's important to kind of play with that, because otherwise that's a heck of a lot of pressure. You don't need to reinvent the wheel each time. There's only so many poses and ways that the body can move, and so understanding again, like the mind, body, nervous system wants a little bit of variety and diversity, and they also want consistency. And this is also, but then look at, I think of traditions like Ashtanga or Bikrams, although Bikrams I would not call a tradition anymore, but that's Bikram. That's another conversation. And even so, like the problematic male teachers aside of these yoga styles, I don't think like they're very repetitive. You're always doing the primary series every single time, and most people may only do that in their Ashtanga career, so to speak, and not get past that. And it worked. It became same with Bikram, it became very popular. So there's something to be said about the things that are working. And there's something to be said about adding diversity, because if we're moving the problem on a physical aspect of that, if we're moving in the same ways, if you're doing your down dog the same way every single time, and then you're doing like the next pose, there becomes, first on a physical level, your nervous system and the muscles, they need different types of movement. They need different types of engagement. So on a really simplified way, they need different ways and more dynamic movements than that same rigid like sun salutation. And then as a teacher too, when I used to teach sun salutations, I don't really do that anymore. When I used to teach them, I would notice those who had maybe came from an Ashtanga background or who had been doing yoga for a long time in my Hatha class, right? In my general sort of like, let's do yoga asana class, I would teach a yoga sun salutation, and I would notice that they would get into this immediate habit vibe. And I don't know if I can explain it correctly, but some of the teachers you might know what I'm talking about, it was almost like they simultaneously, the mind turned off, and also, it's just like they're moving in a habit, and it's like inhale, step the right foot forward, exhale. And
it's just so funny because
like
I
went
am
into a
that
groove.
person. Love like a really rigid practice, and I gravitated eventually. So this is the other part of like, teacher training is like, just because you took your 200 doesn't mean you can't like supplement and add on. And I like, once I completed my 200 hour, I kept on taking other trainings, just like kind of following my interests. And one of them was a course I went through, Ashtanga, Rocket, and Flow. And those are more rigid, but I guess what I liked about Rocket was that it left room for flexibility, because it left room of like, if you can't do this, totally cool, like do that. Or like, if you don't want to, if you need a wall, go walk up to the wall and use the wall. Like that was what I was attracted to, because I did see in the Ashtanga practice. And this is funny when we're talking about like, should you bring your notes or not? I remember going to an Edmonton, I don't know if they're open anymore, an Ashtanga studio, and it was lovely. They were very friendly, but there was no teacher. Basically, there was a teacher walking around the room. And what do? They give you a piece of paper, and it's a self-guided practice. And I've been to several studios like that, where it's funny if a teacher is like hard on themselves, being like, "Oh, I brought a notebook." I'm like, hold on, there's studios where they don't even, like, you are your own teacher and you're literally given a piece of paper to follow. That's how rigid it is. So it's like, it's kind of funny that we would demonize someone for bringing a notebook when a studio runs off the fact that you're only going to get a notebook, not even a teacher. So it's kind of like an interesting.
Yeah, and there's so many layers to unpack even within that too, because then if we're talking as in these inclusive sort of ways, and you are your own teacher, but like the thing is, these rigid
I
things.
still got squeezed, and I probably
Yeah,
shouldn't have. I got pushed in that Ashtanga
right.
class. Like, they come up to you and they're like, twist, let me just like push you closer.
Oh
I'm like,
Lord.
that probably wasn't
My
good.
only yoga injuries have arose from Ashtanga yoga and the adjustments. I know. And I think that's like a really important thing to name as teachers when we're thinking about this. And again, in that variety and diversity, and offering people variety and diversity of movements, but also the frequency of familiarity, and like, okay, let's have that structure. But it is really an underlying story of conformity, and an underlying story of emphasis on a certain aesthetic, and an emphasis on like, okay, an able-bodied, lithe, young, flexible body. And I think it just shows again how the deeper dominant culture shows up in yoga. So yoga is not untouched. From India, and like came to us in a perfect little box, like not untouched by the British rule in India, right? Colonialism and the process of it coming into the West here. And those Western ideals show up. And those Western ideals of let's be homogenized, like let's all fit into that box, let's move the same way. Teachers, we're not giving you the tools to adapt, we're not giving you the tools to understand trauma informed practices.
It's like it's giving you a system. I think that's what the difference is. Like when I think of your teacher training versus like, like I'm gonna air quote it if you can't, if you're listening, I'm air quoting traditional because like, yeah, just what you said. What does that mean if I take air quotes traditional training here in Canada, for instance, right? Like you're taught to teach someone a sequence, but am I being taught to accommodate? And the truth is, like if you're teaching public classes, it's like anyone could walk through your door, and that's kind of like we started with like teacher horror stories. It's like, but that's true, right? Like the scary part is like I've only, let's say, example, ever taught 10 chaturangas to warm up. Someone walks through your door and they're like, I have shoulder surgery and I can't put my leg behind my head, and real things that happen in these practices, and there's nothing worse than feeling like, and I've had injuries, so I think I've felt this feeling where you're in a class and you're like, I can't participate.
Yeah, and especially because yoga is not just about movement. But of course, the yoga classes that we go to at studios and in the West absolutely are predominantly movement based. And then even, I don't know how many times, like I'm thinking of a time like for me, my body pigeon pose in a classical sort of way, just my SI joints, do not love it. The hip, it's just not a pose for my body. And I remember going to a class a bunch of years ago and I was doing some other variation in pigeon pose, and the teacher, very well meaning, very sweet, comes over to me and she's like, you're not doing the pose. Well, what's wrong? And like whispering, because it's like in the midst of the class. And I'm like, no, it's okay. I got it. Like, don't worry about it. I got this. And she's like, no, let me help you. Let me fix you. And I was just like, no, I know what's good for me. And that, and like, and again, that very well-intentioned.
It's like, I need you to fit this mold. I need you to look this way in this posture. So I'm going to help you get to the thing I think you should look like.
Yeah. But I've been that teacher, guaranteed in my early days. I was like a well-meaning, like, oh, let me just help you. And we all, if any of us have been teaching for any length of time, for the most part, we've probably been that, and hopefully learn a little bit more about, okay, well, what is our goal here? Why are we all here in this room? Why are we choosing yoga instead of Pilates, right? So if we're looking for just a movement-based system, there's a lot of other things out there. So what is it about yoga that A, attracted me as a teacher, and B, that keeps people coming to the yoga studios? And we can bring, and so I've named this a number of times, that yoga in the West, as teachers here in classes, are predominantly asana based, movement based. And so how can we, within the movement context, bring in those deeper practices that make yoga yoga, and not just like an exercise fitness class? And I think one of the core, there's many ways, but one of the core ones that I'm the most passionate about is then bringing in this inclusivity, this accessibility, this acknowledgement and understanding that when we come from an anatomy informed place, it's inherently inclusive, because we're not like bringing the pose to the people. We're just, or people to the poke. Like we are like, it's like post schmoes in the West. And as teachers, it's important for us to understand these big concepts. And one of the most important things is, for teaching like a movement-based class, we are bringing in the principles of yoga by bringing in kindness, accessibility, acknowledge. Like if we are not forcing our students into poses, if we are not talking about flexibility and like cues like the fullest expression of the pose, and let's go deeper, and if you can't do this pose, grab a block. If we're saying that kind of language is still perpetuating the cultural dominance of flexibility, able-bodied, ageism, all this stuff that is the stuff of the systems of oppression in the world that we live in. Like want and we us to all be the same and homogenized. And also, total side note, a beautiful movie that I just saw last night, it's fresh in my mind. Go see Sinners, because talking about, everybody go see Sinners. It says it's a thriller. It's not. It is a beautiful movie that actually really beautifully talks about assimilation and white supremacy, and in a vampire sort of way. But if you, and like, it's actually, and it is one of the most, yes, because then you can take what they're saying in this movie and what so many people have been talking about systems of oppression, and you can take that and you can see how we subtly bring that into the yoga practice when we emphasize flexibility, when we prioritize the able-bodied people. So as teachers, one of the most important things that we can do is acknowledge that and shift our teaching into this place of like, okay, I have this understanding of human movement. So to me, I look at that as the foundation. That's when I say anatomy informed yoga, it means I don't necessarily need to have the 4 quadricep muscles memorized and what they are, but I understand what the hip joints need, generally speaking, for most people. And from that understanding, I can apply it to my yoga asana poses. I can actually maybe deconstruct the poses themselves so they don't even look like a pose anymore. But now I'm teaching and offering variations and support for any and all of the bodies to the best that I can within the scope of my practice into the room at any given time. So I don't know, like I hope because we can't take what, like we just like, there's, I think I just get so passionate about this because there's just that story of like, well, I'm not flexible enough to do yoga. And it's like, if we're not examining why we think we need to be flexible in the first place, then we're missing the deeper lessons that our yoga practice and the world that we're in have imparted onto that.
My background is dancing and I'm hypermobile. So I'm the opposite of you. So I went into yoga and I felt like I was rewarded because of my flexibility. Like teachers gave me more attention in a class. I was that person. And what I was truly lacking was strength. And it is so true that I was just like, I probably overdid it on things because I was trying to reach that assumed full expression of the posture, but should I be? And I think it took years of practice, like my own personal practice, and then going through teacher training for me to realize that doesn't matter. And it wasn't until I went through teacher training that I took the time to think about like, why am I even practicing yoga? I felt like when I was just being a student, I was also mimicking the teachers. So like thinking about now when you're becoming a new teacher, you're probably going to just like mimic what you hear. And if all you hear is this like one style, this one practice, and you don't think about what kind of teacher do I want to be? How do I want my students to feel in this class? Am I being inclusive? Then I know I probably wasn't because I was hypermobile, flexible, messy, right? And then so I'm like, yes, if you can't touch your toes, grab a block.
Yeah. Rather than as the teacher going like, hey, everybody grab a block. I don't even give the option. I find in the sense that it's like, because I love this anatomy informed approach because I call it the Great Equalizer, that the people who are super flexible, the people who aren't, the way that we approach movement, because it's coming from this mobility functional different, like rather than just being like stretchy, get my leg around my head, to the all never ending desire to be like deeper, 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 flexible, flexible, flexible. It's like, no, we're here to really kick on those muscles, to really wake up and like, again, move in a sustainable way. It's the Great Equalizer. So if I were going to do a forward bend in this approach and want people, so as a teacher, then I'm like, everybody grab a block. And it's not just going to be a forward bend. I'm going to teach us how to actually kind of do some actions to create engagement in the hamstrings that's going to support both the hypermobile and the not so mobile. And then there's not even a conversation or an emphasis on flexibility. We don't even say that word in these classes.
I don't teach physically like classes anymore. Like that's not my role in the studio. I feel like when I was still teaching in-person classes, I did get to a point where I literally just put yoga blocks on everyone's mat because I also discovered how good it felt just to use them. I feel like these are exactly the kind of stuff we need to talk about in the mentorship, these like real experiences and tools and like how to build a teaching life that feels sustainable and good and true to who you are as a teacher. You're not mimicking or trying to fit this like expected mold. So yeah, if you're listening to this and you think, oh man, I want more of this, you're going to love our Inspired Teacher Mentorship Program. And I think our yoga teacher training, which has a 200 and a 300-hour option, because this is all stuff that I know you tackle.
And deeper than that, as I talked about creating these inclusive spaces, this shows up in action in our trainings. It's not just like this like ethereal, like, okay, this is how we include, and maybe it's like the spaces it's that you're in an experience that's literally that, because at the heart of it, when we're in, so I'm going to assume, and like everybody listening, raise your hand if you've ever been in a class where you feel like you don't belong. We have been in those, and that is huge. And so so it's not just like, okay, inclusive so I'm doing movements and poses that fit my body, but I also want to show up as my weirdo, wacky self, or however I am, and feel like I don't have to fit in. I just actually belong as I am, where we really focus on these like comfortable, warm spaces that you, and as teachers, if we can cultivate that, if we can cultivate spaces where people are seen and heard as themselves, and one of the many ways that we can do that is the languaging, the cueing, as we've been talking about. And another way is to then continue to be like, this is people and community first. This, and as a teacher, it's not about me. And again, these systems that show up, the systems of like power in the world that show up are based on hierarchies. And oh my goodness, like I remember in my early years of yoga. So again, this was 20 years ago. And I feel like none of this conversation about inclusivity and accessibility was in my world. Maybe it was in some people's world, and I hope so. But for me, it just was, there was this prevalent story in like 20 years ago of just like, you have to find your teacher. And you're like, capital T, right? And there's this like duality inside of me who I've always been a rebel, like pretty quick. Like I was a little punk. I would like grunge days in the 90s in high school and stuff. I very consciously in my own wiring have like rejected conformity, but not immune to these power. There are these systems of power because at the same time, so on one hand, I'm like, you're your own, like young 20-year-old Brea in yoga, you're your own guru. Don't like listen to. And at the exact same time, this other part of my brain was like, but I have to find my teacher. And if I don't find my teacher, like, because it was like this this mythicized sort of thing, because also when you find your teacher in that like general, like may we all find teachers, and we have amazing, very like so many teachers in that way, but it was always this hierarchical teacher, which, going down the rabbit hole of like, that's how cults happen. That's how abuse in the yoga world happens.
You and I have talked about capital T teachers a lot. And I took like an extended, I've taken several meditation courses, and I've talked to you about my capital T teacher moment where I felt like there was some weird mind control attempt. And I was like, thank God I'm aware. And I think I, at that point, had gone through, well, I know I had gone through my 200 hour, and that was part of the conversation was this. And so when it happened to me, I saw it for what it was. But I think a lot of people don't, because there is that push to find the capital T teacher.
We are primed. And it's not, because again, I'm going to say this 5 million times in the rest of my, like, it's like, yoga is not immune to the systems of the world that we live in. And we are primed for hierarchy on so many ways. There's people at the top, and there's a whole bunch of other people at the bottom. And that shows up in yoga. So that we, of course, and then it's spiritual. Then it's like, I have to find my like spiritual teacher. And so we're going to be, and it's power. And we're going to be more primed to give that power away. The people in power are primed to take that, because doesn't that feel good if people are like, yes, Brea, please tell me everything. And like I can see, and especially males, and then like the abuse of power on that way is just, it's a tale as old as time. Yeah, and it still continues to happen. But I have a point here that I want to make, though. So, like, just knowing that this is a thing, we think that when we can be aware of the hierarchies that show up, and when we can subvert that in our classes as teachers, as the space holders, as the facilitators, yeah, it's about me, and it's totally not about me. And as teachers, knowing that people will come in and try to put you on a pedestal, or be surprised that you swear, or be surprised, because I don't, that's another side funny thing of like, I don't know how many times people are like, oh, are you a vegan? And oh, you must meditate all the time. And like all these assumptions, a lot of people are coming in on assumptions. But my point here is so like in our mentorship and our trainings, coming back to that conversation about belonging, we can't have true belonging if the teacher's at the top of the pedestal or top of that hierarchy. There's ways that we can facilitate, that we can hold space and be in the time that we're all together. So when you're teaching your 5 p.m. class on a Tuesday night, you're that space holder. You do have to show up as the teacher, but not in that power dominance of like, I know what's better for you and your body. And I'm coming into this class and like, I'm creating this vibe that everybody has to sort of fit in and conform, and everybody has to get flexible in the same way and wear the same things. And I think, yeah, it's a really important experience. And if you've never been in an experience, and especially in a learning environment where that's subverted and that's very consciously changed, it's powerful. And we do this in our trainings. I keep mentioning, so we have our yoga, our Heart and Bones teacher training that we've been doing online for like 7 years now. So I've been seeing that even in online spaces, like, and me and Kat, my co-teacher, like say this stuff over and over and over to people. Like, one of the first things that we teach, and this will come up in the mentorship as well, is that there are no mistakes. So again, going back into that sense of hierarchy, like we have to get things right. We come from a performative culture. These systems of oppression want us to like conform and perform and be experts and be good. And then that comes into our yoga practice. How many times have we felt like, so, Ula with a really flexible body got like celebrated because she conformed so perfectly. And if somebody wasn't, they didn't get celebrated in the same way. Oh, something's wrong with me, or we're competitive and I'm looking at the person beside me and they can get their leg here and what's wrong with me, And so like knowing that this programming is inside of all of us, we're doing a lot of deprogramming. And again, this is bringing those deeper teachings of yoga. And it's beautiful to see the shift that happens in the space of a mentorship or the space of a training where this is at the heart and the core of it when we're creating these. So again, when we're saying create inclusive spaces, yeah, it's physical, but it's also about like unpacking and being like, there are no mistakes. You fell out of that pose. Great. Oh, you didn't get that, I don't know, like question right on our little mini quiz or something in the teacher training. Nobody is like, you're wrong. You're never going to teach. It's like, none of this matters because what is yoga? What is yoga? But it is a practice of self-awareness so that we can learn about ourselves, so that we can help bring up the liberation for all of us. It's self-liberation. It's society liberation. It's about liberating ourselves from these systems that keep us down and tell us that who we are isn't great enough. That's yoga. And if you're listening to this being like, well, I thought this podcast was going to talk about like trikonasana and farting in classes or like, it's all part of it. But
I was thinking about like the horror stories we could tell. It's funny because I feel like I have more horror stories as a student who is a teacher. Hey, it's Editing Ula popping in. Brea and I kept on talking for so long, we decided to turn this into a 2-part episode. So good news, more coming your way. In the meantime, I think it's really important that I let you know that if you are interested in our yoga teacher mentorship program with Brea, it is available. So I'm going to put the link into our description. Also, we do have our 200 and 300 hour yoga teacher training available. I'll put that in below as well. So if you would like more clarity and support, we got you. Just keep listening and click the links below. And I will keep on editing.